In the early 1800s, Mexico had only just broken free from Spanish colonial rule. The young republic faced political instability, economic struggles, and vast, nearly ungoverned lands to the north. Meanwhile, its northern neighbor, the United States, was growing fast territorially and ideologically under the banner of manifest destiny. This belief held that Americans were divinely destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But that destiny came at someone else's cost. As American settlers flooded into Texas, then part of Mexico, tensions flared and the two nations went to war in 1846. What followed was one of the most lopsided conflicts in history. In less than 2 years, the United States had conquered more than half of Mexico. So how did this happen? And why does it matter today? Part 1. A question of where the border is. This is a ranch in southern Texas. It's also an archaeological site and a nature preserve. But it's probably best known as the place where, on April 1846, American troops led by General Zachary Taylor clashed with Mexican forces under General Mariano Arista. The fighting continued for days, resulting in 5 dead Americans and 20 wounded. Though the battle itself wasn't particularly consequential, the skirmish was used by President James K. Polk to declare war on Mexico. Why? Well, because he said that Mexican troops had invaded U.S. territory. Specifically, he meant this area here, which was disputed by both countries. This map shows where the United States believed its border to be. This one shows Mexico's claim. And this shows where the actual fighting took place. Today, we know the border to be somewhere around here. So what happened? Well, back in the early 1800s, neither country knew for sure where the border between them lay. You see, when Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, it inherited this huge stretch of land known as Texas. But while Mexico City officials drew the border with the U.S. like this, they left the exact location up to future negotiation. As it turned out, there was a big difference between where politicians said the border was and where it actually was on the ground. For starters, Texas itself was enormous. Its borders were vaguely defined, shifting sands, conflicting land grants, and thousands of miles of frontier. Then there was this. When Mexico briefly lost Texas in the 1830s, it established a new border at the Nueces River. But when peace was restored, the old border was put back in place, and so the confusion remained. Despite this ambiguity, Americans began pouring into Texas during the 1820s. They purchased vast tracts of land from the Mexican government and set up shop along the Rio Grande. For their part, Mexicans saw this influx of foreign settlers as a threat to their national sovereignty. In response, they passed laws restricting land purchases to citizens and gave military governors broad powers to enforce them. Predictably, those restrictions angered American settlers who felt they'd been promised otherwise. And in 1835, Texas revolted against Mexican rule. 1 year later, it declared itself independent. When news of the Texan Revolution reached the White House, President Andrew Jackson was not impressed. He refused to recognize the new Republic of Texas and ordered the U.S. Army to remain neutral. Not everyone was happy about this. Remember, manifest destiny held that America was destined to stretch from coast to coast. And many Americans, including some in Congress, thought Texas should be annexed or added to the United States. But Jackson opposed expansion. He didn't want war with Mexico and feared that annexing Texas would provoke one. So he let the issue sit until he was out of office. In the meantime, the question of Texas became a major political issue. And in 1845, with President Polk in the White House, it finally came to a vote. Polk campaigned on the promise of expanding U.S. territory, and his party won. Shortly after his inauguration, Texas was annexed, much to the fury of Mexico. The U.S. government sent word that it considered the Rio Grande to be the official border. Mexico responded by sending troops to the disputed area. There they fought the U.S. Army under General Taylor. And when news of the fighting reached Washington, Polk went to work whipping up public support for war. Part 2. Mr. Polk's War. As soon as he took office, President Polk created a military center that stretched from Texas to the Pacific Northwest. He appointed General Winfield Scott to lead his forces into Mexico. While Scott prepared his troops, other U.S. generals took Texas. Soon, however, it became clear that the Army wasn't going to find much success coming south from Texas. So Polk sent General Stephen Kearny to take the northern route. That meant marching across an almost completely unknown and heavily mountainous region. To make matters worse, the U.S. had no supplies set up along the way, and soldiers were forced to live off the land. Yet, in spite of these hardships, Kearny and his men succeeded in taking New Mexico and California. At the same time, General Scott and his troops moved west through Mexico, conquering Veracruz and marching toward Mexico City. As American troops advanced, Polk dispatched diplomats to try and purchase California and New Mexico for $30 million. But once those offers were rejected, he authorized his generals to keep fighting. On September 14, 1847, American and Mexican forces met in the small town of Chapultepec. The next day, the U.S. Army entered Mexico City without firing a single shot. The war was basically over. But if it seemed like the United States was winning easily, that wasn't entirely true. You see, while the U.S. had superior firepower and organization, the Mexican army fought bravely. Their main problem was simply that they were vastly outnumbered. In total, 177,000 Americans fought against an army of around 35,000 Mexicans. Moreover, the conflict was deeply unpopular in the United States. Northern abolitionists actively worked to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories. And even some pro-slavery Southerners thought the war was pointless. Still, when push came to shove, Congress voted to go to war, and most Americans fell in line. Ultimately, the United States spent less than 2 years conquering more than half of Mexico. When Polk told General Scott to stop his advance, Mexico City was already surrounded. The treaty officially ending the war was signed in 1848, and by 1853, all of the newly acquired lands were part of the United States. Today, the war is often remembered as a great American victory. But that's not the whole story. Sure, the U.S. Army won decisive battles and killed or captured thousands of Mexican soldiers. But consider that those victories came at what cost? For starters, while casualty records are incomplete, historians estimate that 13,000 American soldiers died during the war, mostly due to disease. Then there were the Mexicans, who suffered even greater losses. In all, some 25,000 Mexican soldiers and 200,000 civilians are thought to have perished. Moreover, in addition to the human cost, Mexico lost more than half of its territory. And in the decades following the war, it found itself bogged down in political instability, economic woes, and territorial disputes with its neighbors. Epilogue. Why does it matter today? Few subjects are as fraught in modern Mexican-American relations as the war between the two nations in 1846. Some Americans celebrated the victory over Mexico as proof of their nation's superiority. Others condemned it as a shameful display of U.S. imperialism. In recent years, scholars have begun to re-examine the war and its legacy, arguing that it deserves a fresh look. They have a point. Historians used to hand-wave away the war on the border as a simple conflict between two neighbors. But today, more nuanced studies explore the complexities of the war, including its causes, consequences, and meaning. For instance, scholars have examined how the war was fought, shedding light on the contributions of non-military actors such as indigenous people, women, and enslaved people. Others have looked at how the war was remembered, shaping the identities of both nations. Ultimately, by learning more about the conflict, we can better understand the challenges facing the United States and Mexico today. After all, the two countries remain neighbors, and their shared history continues to shape their relationship. If you liked this video, be sure to check out our series on ancient warfare. In 1846, an American congressman named John Slidell traveled to Mexico City to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the border dispute. He carried with him a polite letter from President James Polk offering to purchase the disputed territory. The Mexican government rejected his offer out of hand and sent him home without even bothering to read his letter. So America went to war. The war that followed is now known as the Mexican War. It was one of the most controversial conflicts in American history. Some historians argue that it was simply a matter of manifest destiny, the God-given right of the United States to expand across the North American continent. Others claim that it was nothing more than naked imperialism, plain and simple. Whatever the truth may be, the war had a profound impact on both countries and their peoples. It led to the deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians alike, and resulted in the largest territorial acquisition in American history. Today, we're going to look at how this war began. If you enjoy learning about underreported history, give us a thumbs up to help us grow. The origins of the war can be traced back to the Texas Revolution of 1835. But to really understand those events, we need to go back a bit further. For centuries before the arrival of Europeans, the area that would become Texas was home to several 100,000 indigenous people. But in 1519, the Spanish conquistador Alonso Alvarez de Pineda explored the area, claiming it for Spain. For the next 200 years, Spanish missionaries and colonial administrators did their best to settle the region. They built missions and presidios, or small forts, in an attempt to keep the area safe from hostile Native Americans and, more important, from the British to the north. But the Spanish struggled to hold on to Texas. Throughout the 1700s, it was raided repeatedly by French, British, and American traders. By the early 1800s, Mexico was in charge of this part of the world. But when the Mexican War of Independence broke out in 1810, Texas was largely ignored. This was probably for the best, because if the Royalists had managed to win the war, Texas would likely have been part of the independent empire of Brazil. But the Mexican insurgents had other plans. By 1821, the Royalist forces in Texas were gone. And 2 years later, Mexico's new government formally took control of the province. The era of Spanish rule was over. Mexico quickly found itself facing the same problems that had plagued Spain for so long. It couldn't stop Anglo-American settlers from moving into Texas. Granted, these people weren't exactly flooding into the region. Between 1821 and 1830, fewer than 5,000 Americans settled in Texas, although most of them didn't stay. But the trickle of American immigrants represented a much greater threat to Mexico than the Spanish had ever imagined. These settlers refused to assimilate into Mexican culture. They wanted to preserve their own way of life, and they had no intention of accepting Mexican rule. Things came to a head in 1835 when Mexican authorities attempted to enforce a ban on slavery, which was still legal in Texas despite being abolished in the rest of Mexico. The local militias resisted, and a full-scale rebellion broke out the following year. What followed was one of the bloodiest chapters in Texas history, a war remembered today as the Texas Revolution. It's not relevant to our story, but it's worth mentioning that the war was a resounding success for the Anglo-American rebels, led by men like Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin. They defeated the Mexican army and won recognition for an independent republic. But Mexico never acknowledged the independence of the Republic of Texas, meaning that, technically speaking, Texas was still a part of Mexico. What happens next brings us back to where we started. In 1845, President James Polk decided to annex Texas and make it the 28th state of the Union. For Mexico, this was an act of aggression, and they responded by cutting diplomatic ties with the United States. But there was nothing they could do to stop it. Texas was gone forever. Or was it? To this day, the Mexican government refuses to recognize the border at the Rio Grande. They insist that it is, in fact, the Nueces River, more than 100 miles to the north. This might seem like a relatively minor disagreement over a couple of rivers, and in many ways it was. But in the context of American expansion across the continent, it was huge. In 1845, the admission of Texas caused a political crisis in Washington. D.C. annexing Texas meant starting a war with Mexico. That was something everyone agreed on. But once the fighting started, no one could agree on where it should take place. President James Polk was determined to take advantage of this situation. He sent troops into what Mexico considered to be its own territory. Their orders were to stop any Mexican forces that tried to cross the Nueces River and prevent them from retaking Texas. On April 1846, a group of Mexican cavalrymen attacked an American detachment near the Nueces River. When the dust settled, 3 Americans lay dead and 4 wounded. This incident was immediately reported to Washington, D.C., and used as justification to march south. Soon, tens of thousands of American troops were pushing deep into Mexico. The fighting that ensued is known as the Mexican War. But that's a little misleading. Despite the scale of the conflict, neither side really wanted a war. Both Polk and the Mexican president, Antonio López de Santa Anna, had come to power promising to resolve the border dispute peacefully. But once negotiations failed, each leader saw an opportunity to expand their territory. Polk had campaigned on the slogan 54-40 or fight, referring to his desire to push the border all the way to the Columbia River. Santa Anna wanted to push the Americans all the way back to the Rio Grande. There was just one problem. Neither man could actually achieve his goals. Polk knew that any attempt to seize California would stretch American resources too thin. And Santa Anna knew that he couldn't win back Texas without massive help from France or Britain. As it turned out, Polk didn't need all of Oregon because he already had Texas, and Santa Anna's attempts to get foreign help failed. On top of that, his military strategy was a disaster. Instead of focusing on winning battles, Santa Anna spent most of the war in prison. He was captured at the Battle of Veracruz in March 1847 and spent the next 2 years locked up in a house in Indiana. So who actually fought the war? Mostly young volunteer soldiers. A total of 17,000 Americans and 20,000 Mexicans volunteered for service. And their deeds are what the war is remembered for. There was General Winfield Scott's daring march on Mexico City, General Zachary Taylor's victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, and the epic stand at Chapultepec Castle, where a group of Mexican cadets defended the nation's capital until the very end. But what's often forgotten are the politicians who sent these men to fight. And perhaps we should remember them because in the end, it was their decisions that determined the outcome of the war. After all, wars aren't won on the battlefield. They're won at the negotiating table. When Santa Anna was finally released from prison in September 1848, the United States controlled most of northern Mexico. So he had little choice but to accept the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty officially ended the war and forced Mexico to cede more than half of its territory to the United States. Today, that land is part of 5 different American states: California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The United States paid Mexico $15 million for the land, plus another $3.25 million to compensate former Mexican owners whose land had been seized during the war. All told, the war had been a great success for the United States. Not only had it acquired vast new territories, but it had also established itself as a major player on the world stage. But the cost had been high. More than 13,000 Americans had died during the conflict, most of them from disease. The war had also left a deep scar on Mexican society. Many Mexicans felt that their country had been unjustly and illegally taken from them, and they never forgave the United States for it. The legacy of the Mexican War continues to this day. In recent years, there has been a growing movement in Mexico and the United States to remember the war and its victims. Alright, so the last time we met, we were wrapping up our discussion on how the United States acquired Texas, and in doing so, created a very serious diplomatic headache for ourselves, and that headache was going to get much bigger. The year was 1846, and tensions simmered between the United States and Mexico over the annexation of Texas. But for President James K. Polk the issue ran deeper. He envisioned an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and his rallying cry was manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was divinely ordained to expand westward, and he wanted Texas to be the stepping stone. In order to acquire all of the territory that he felt like the U.S. was entitled to, though he was gonna have to do something pretty bold, and that's what we gonna discuss today on this channel. Let's get to it. Okay, so to start off here, let me get rid of this guy. Alright, so here's where we left off last episode. The United States has just annexed Texas, and now President James K. Polk is in office, and he is ready to begin his grand plan, which he referred to as manifest destiny. Basically, the idea that the United States not only should, but was destined by God to expand its dominion across the entire North American continent. And Polk believed that acquiring additional territory in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest would be a major step in that direction. Now, there were many Americans who supported this idea, but it wasn't exactly popular with Mexico. They still considered Texas their own, and they didn't want to see any more of it taken away. Additionally, since Texas was basically just an extension of the United States at this point, if they could take all of this land west of Texas, then they'd basically have access to the Pacific Ocean. And that was something that Mexico absolutely did not want to allow to happen. Now, the situation was further complicated by the fact that the United States and Mexico never agreed upon the border of Texas. And since they couldn't agree on that, they couldn't agree on exactly where the annexation ended. Mexico claimed that it was somewhere around the Rio Grande, whereas the U.S. claimed that it was way down here at the Nueces River. So this whole situation was kind of a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. So then, why did Polk decide to light the match? Well, because he wanted the land, and he wanted it bad. Like, this is a guy who literally ran for president on the slogan 5-4-40 or fight. That's how much he wanted this land. I mean, he was willing to go to war over it. So he started making plans. You see, in early 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move his forces to the area south of the Nueces River, which was still claimed by Mexico. He also sent another general, General Winfield Scott, to occupy the disputed territory around the Rio Grande. Then he waited. And what he was waiting for was for something to happen, some sort of incident that he could use as a casus belli, a reason to declare war. And it didn't take long. On April 25, 1846, a group of Mexican cavalrymen attacked a small detachment of U.S. soldiers north of the Rio Grande. The attack caught the Americans by surprise, and they were forced to retreat. In the skirmish, 16 American soldiers were either killed or wounded. When news of the incident reached Washington, D.C., Polk wasted no time in using it to his advantage. He called Congress into session and asked them to declare war on Mexico. In his message to Congress, Polk stated that American blood has been shed on American soil. The phrase American soil was a calculated choice designed to evoke a sense of outrage and patriotism among the American people. For decades, Americans had been shedding blood, defending their national honor against attacks from abroad. But this time, it was different. This time, the blood had been shed not on foreign soil, but on American soil. The call to action was clear. The United States had been attacked, and it was up to Congress to avenge the deaths of the 16 soldiers who had died in the skirmish. There were some in Congress who opposed the war, but they were a minority. On May 13, 1846, the United States formally declared war on Mexico. Okay, so at this point, we've established that James K. Polk was pretty eager to get into a war with Mexico. But you've got to remember that this was also a time when it was incredibly difficult to get around news traveled slowly. And most Americans didn't even know that the war had been declared until several weeks after it began. But once they found out, they were largely behind it. I mean, this was a time when newspapers were still relatively new, and the vast majority of Americans got their news from these partisan papers that tended to exaggerate the truth in order to sell more papers. And the stories that were being published about the war were absolutely wild. It was said that American women were fainting dead away when they heard about the atrocities committed by the Mexican army, and men were running around the streets waving their swords in the air and shouting onward to Mexico. There was even a song composed specifically for the occasion titled "The War with Mexico is Coming." So yeah, the American public was absolutely on board for this war. But what about Mexico? How did they feel about it? Well, to be honest, they weren't exactly thrilled. They saw the coming conflict as an opportunity to finally put an end to the Texas issue once and for all, and maybe even reclaim some of the territory that they lost in the process. Unfortunately for them, though, they were outmatched in terms of both resources and manpower, and the war was essentially over before it even began. Okay, so at this point, I think it's important to clarify something. Yes, the United States won the war, but that doesn't mean that it was a walk in the park. The Mexican War was a long and bloody affair that resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. In fact, the U.S. suffered more casualties during this war than they did during World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. But despite the high casualty count, the war was pretty decisive in the end. The U.S. was able to capture several key cities, including Veracruz, Mexico City, and Puebla, and they were able to force the Mexican army to surrender. The treaty that ended the war granted the United States all of the territory it had been seeking, including California, Nevada, Utah, and yes, even Texas. And so in the end, the war was a resounding success for the United States and a total disaster for Mexico. But hey, at least it gave us some great music, right? Alright, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get back to the video. Alright, so now that the United States had officially declared war on Mexico, it was time to figure out how they were going to win it. President Polk knew that in order to succeed, he needed to have a strong military presence in Mexico. But he also knew that he couldn't rely solely on the regular army to do the job, so he turned to volunteers. On May 1846, he called for 50,000 volunteers to join the fight, and boy did they ever. Over the next few months, thousands of American men from all walks of life came forward to offer their services. Many of them were young and eager for adventure. Others were older and more experienced. But they all shared one common goal, a desire to see Mexico defeated. But while the United States was able to raise a large volunteer force, Mexico was not. The Mexican military was simply not equipped to deal with the coming invasion. And so within a few weeks, the U.S. had taken control of most of northern Mexico. But this isn't exactly what President Polk had in mind. See, he had always envisioned a much larger war, a war that would result in the conquest of all of Mexico. But as it turned out, the Mexican army was much more formidable than he had anticipated. And as such, he was forced to scale back his ambitions. In the end, the war would result in the United States gaining all of the territory it had originally sought, but no more than that. And so that, my friends, is the story of how the United States went to war with Mexico. It's a story of ambition, greed, and yes, even war profiteering. But hey, at least it gave us some great music, right? Okay, so this is Chapter 3, which means it's time to talk about the war itself, also known as the Mexican-American War. And in order to keep from getting too bogged down in one particular theater of fighting, we're going to break up this chapter into 3 sections. First, we'll talk about the fighting in northern Mexico. Second, we'll discuss the capture of California and other western lands. And third, we'll follow General Winfield Scott's campaign that culminated in the capture of Mexico City. Alright, so let's start in the north. In charge of the northern front was General Zachary Taylor, who began his campaign by winning some easy victories along the Rio Grande. In February 1846, he crossed into northern Mexico with 4,000 troops and quickly captured the cities of Nacués and Laurento. This was mostly because the Mexican army was unready for action, and their leadership was still hoping that the U.S. wouldn't actually declare war. But once it became clear that war had indeed been declared, the Mexican government activated its army and sent General Pedro de Ampudia to stop Taylor. And so in April 1846, Taylor set up camp near the city of Monterrey. Ampudia tried to force Taylor to fight him in the open field, but Taylor refused, instead choosing to wait until he could get more men. Because Taylor was dug into such strong defensive positions, though Ampudia decided to lay siege to them. For the next 2 months, Ampudia bombarded Taylor's camp, but they were unable to dislodge the Americans. Taylor's soldiers would go on to become known as the Army of the Bucktail, because of the tails of their buckskin coats, which they used to wipe the sweat off their faces. And man, did they sweat. It got so hot that many of them stripped down to just their trousers. While they were digging in, you can imagine how that looked. Basically, Taylor's army was a ragtag group of frontiersmen, farmers and backwoodsmen, but they were tenacious and well-led. So when Ampudia finally lifted the siege and retreated, Taylor pursued him all the way to Monterrey. And here we have to talk about the Battle of Monterrey, which was one of the hardest-fought battles of the entire war. It lasted for 3 days, September through 21, 1846. On the first day, Taylor pushed forward, but his troops were forced to retreat after sustaining heavy losses. That night, Taylor's commanders wanted to pull back even further, but Taylor refused. He said, "We are not going to set up camp again, while there is a man left to fight." So Taylor reorganized his troops and attacked once more. Again, they almost lost, but they managed to drive the Mexicans out of the city. And when Ampudia refused to surrender the fort, Taylor ordered artillery fire to pound it for hours. Finally, the Mexican commander surrendered the fort. It cost the Americans dearly, though nearly 800 total casualties, around 30% of his force. That made the Battle of Monterrey 4 times more costly than any battle of the War of 1812. Taylor would go on to take several more cities in northern Mexico before the end of the year, including the important city of Veracruz. But now I want to shift our focus to the west, because as Taylor was taking northern Mexico, another group of Americans took over California. As we discussed in Chapter 2, there were only about 1,000 Americans living in California when the war broke out. But many of them had already been involved in local politics and were not afraid to seize land for the United States. In fact, when war broke out, 33 American settlers in Sonoma raised a flag that read, "California for the Bear Republic," an event that became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Now, the U.S. didn't officially recognize the revolt, but in June 1846, Congress appropriated $30,000 to support military operations in California. So, technically, I guess they kind of did. Under the direction of Commodore John D. Sloat, a naval squadron seized the city of Monterrey, and then the Americans began marching south. They were met with little resistance from the Mexican army, except for a small engagement at the town of Los Positos. You see, the Mexican army was busy fighting Taylor in the north, and they also did and realized that the Americans were coming for California. In fact, it would be another 2 months after the Battle of Los Positos before word reached Mexico City that the Americans had taken California. Anyway, in September 1846, the U.S. Navy took the port of San Diego, and in January 1847, the last Mexican troops evacuated California. Also in January, U.S. forces took the city of Alta, California, which put an end to large-scale Mexican resistance in the region. Now you should know that the war wasn't over in California, because the Mexican government never formally recognized the loss of these territories. But anyway, that's how the U.S. went from having a population of 1,000 people in California to owning nearly 900,000 square miles of land. But we're not done with this section yet, because I also have to tell you about New Mexico. As Taylor was campaigning in northern Mexico, he heard rumors that Santa Fe was ripe for the taking. But when he dispatched General James S. Kearny to take the territory, Kearny was forced to fight a few battles before he could secure Santa Fe for the U.S. The most notable of these engagements was the Battle of El Carmen, where Kearny's forces beat back a Mexican cavalry charge. This was significant because it was the largest mounted force ever to be deployed against the U.S. Army. There were about 1,200 Mexican cavalrymen against less than 200 Americans. The victory at El Carmen paved the way for American expansion into Texas and the rest of the Southwest. Okay, so now let's move on to the third section of the chapter, the campaign to take Mexico City. To lead this effort, President Polk selected General Winfield Scott, one of the most experienced American officers of the time. And Scott's task was pretty simple: take Mexico City. Unfortunately for Scott, though, his route to Mexico City would not be simple. His first objective was to take the port of Veracruz, which was still occupied by the Mexican army. So in March 1847, Scott landed 12,000 troops near the city. But before he could do anything, he had to deal with a cholera epidemic that killed over 1,500 of his men. Once the epidemic had passed, Scott marched on Veracruz, forcing the Mexican commander to evacuate the city. Now, you might recall that Taylor had already taken Veracruz more than a year earlier, but he had to do that without taking casualties. And in doing so, he pretty much exhausted the entire supply base. So if Scott wanted to march across Mexico, he would need to establish supply lines all the way from Veracruz to Mexico City. But the biggest problem he faced was that he was 300 miles from Mexico City and the nearest railroad was 100 miles away. So Scott had no choice but to march overland. By the time Scott and his army arrived in Puebla, they had been walking for 6 weeks. Most of them were barefoot. Their clothes were worn and torn, and their shoes were made of leather scraps. But it was here in Puebla that relief began to arrive. Within a month, Scott's army was resupplied and ready to march on Mexico City. So in late August 1847, Scott's army began the arduous trek toward Mexico City. It was extremely difficult going, but they weren't under attack, which meant that they had time to plan ahead and ration their supplies. But as they approached the city, the Mexican defense stiffened. At the Battle of Atlacoma, the U.S. Army was beaten back and forced to retreat 10 miles to the town of Chalma. Once they were regrouped, Scott ordered another assault on the Mexican position, but they were beaten back once more. All told, Scott's army had marched 35 miles and suffered almost 4,500 casualties. But they were close. So Scott pressed on, and on September 13, 1847, they entered Mexico City. The capture of Mexico City effectively ended the war. 2 weeks later, Mexican leaders signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded all of present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, all of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, and parts of Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma to the United States. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of Chapter 3. Hey there, and welcome back to my channel, where we bring you the craziest and funkiest facts from human history. Now, it's been a while since we last visited our friends south of the border. And if you remember from Chapter 2, when America first set foot in Texas, things didn't exactly go swimmingly between these two neighbors. Well, by the 1840s, things had escalated into full-blown war, with America marching towards Mexico City itself. But how did they get there? What happened in between the Alamo and the American occupation of Mexico City? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. So stick around for more. Chapter 4, A Nation at Gunpoint. By 1848, Mexico was exhausted and in ruins. Its military was all but non-existent, and the once proud nation had been pushed all the way back to its capital. Just a few months earlier, American forces had captured Monterrey, the second largest city in Mexico. But the following year, after a brutal 3-day battle, the Americans under General Winfield Scott managed to capture the port of Veracruz. This left Mexico City open to attack, and Santa Anna knew that he had lost the war. His only hope now was to negotiate a peace treaty with the Americans. He sent a letter to Washington asking for peace talks, but this was refused until American troops took possession of Mexico City. Once Santa Anna accepted this harsh ultimatum, he sent a delegation to meet with Scott, who made one thing clear. Mexico could not keep the peace without ceding vast amounts of territory to the United States. On August 7, 1847, American troops entered Mexico City, and it seemed as though Santa Anna would have to concede the entire country to them. But as the Americans occupied the capital, they found themselves in an even more dire situation than expected. Disease ran rampant through their ranks, killing twice as many soldiers as had died in battle. Scott realized that he couldn't hold Mexico City without making peace. So, in September, he met again with a Mexican delegation in the nearby town of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The terms were devastating for Mexico. It gave up over half of its territory, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed $3 million in Mexican debts to American citizens. The signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought an end to the war. But it also marked the beginning of a new era in Mexican history. The country had been stripped of nearly half of its territory, and millions of its citizens had either become Mexican Americans or had been killed or displaced by the war. In the aftermath of the conflict, Mexico was left in a state of political and economic turmoil that would have a profound impact on its future. But wait, let us go back to the beginning of the show where we talked about how America was marching on Mexico City. How did they get so far? How did they take Monterrey? And most importantly, why did they do it? In May of 1846, President James K. Polk declared war on Mexico. He was determined to expand U.S. territory to the Pacific Ocean. This meant conquering Mexico and adding its vast lands to the United States. The first major battle of the war took place in northern Mexico. American troops, led by General Zachary Taylor, clashed with Mexican forces in the small town of Palo Alto. The battle was fierce and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. But the Americans emerged victorious, marking the beginning of their advance into Mexican territory. Following their victory at Palo Alto, Taylor's troops continued their march southward, eventually reaching the city of Monterrey, an important military and industrial center. Monterrey was heavily fortified and defended by a large number of Mexican troops. The Battle of Monterrey began on April 22, 1847, with the American forces attempting to storm the city's defenses. Despite fierce fighting and heavy losses, the Americans were able to gain a foothold within the city walls. However, due to dwindling supplies and concerns about further casualties, General Taylor ultimately decided to retreat from Monterrey. This decision was met with criticism from some who believed that the U.S. had missed an opportunity to make significant gains in Mexico. But Taylor's cautious approach likely saved many American lives and allowed for a strategic realignment of forces. Despite the setback at Monterrey, the war between the U.S. and Mexico continued. American troops under the command of General Winfield Scott launched a major offensive in 1847, capturing key cities such as Veracruz and Puebla. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Chapultepec, which resulted in the capture of Mexico City and the eventual collapse of Mexican resistance. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on February 2, 1848, officially ending the war and leading to the vast territorial expansion of the United States. Now that we know how America won the war, let's take a moment to look at what Mexico lost. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, brought an end to the war between Mexico and the United States. But it came at a tremendous cost for Mexico, which was forced to cede vast territories to the United States. The treaty included provisions for the exchange of prisoners of war and the evacuation of American troops from Mexican territory. However, it was primarily known for the massive land cessions that took place. Mexico was compelled to give up nearly half of its national territory to the United States. This included significant regions such as California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. These areas were acquired by the United States for approximately $15 million, a sum that was intended to compensate Mexico for its losses. Additionally, the United States agreed to assume approximately $3 million worth of Mexican debts held by American citizens. The loss of territory was a devastating blow to Mexico, which had already suffered greatly during the war. It not only resulted in the displacement of millions of Mexicans, who now found themselves living within the borders of the United States, but also deprived Mexico of valuable natural resources and strategic regions. The impact of the land cessions on Mexico's national identity, economy, and security would continue to be felt for generations to come. As we just mentioned, millions of Mexicans were now living within the borders of the United States and did not necessarily want to be there. Over the course of the 19th century, millions of Mexican Americans migrated north from Mexico into the southwestern region of the United States. This migration was driven by a complex interplay of factors, including the desire for better economic opportunities, political instability and conflict in Mexico, and the allure of free or inexpensive land in the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war between Mexico and the United States in 1848, played a significant role in this migration. The treaty forced Mexico to cede vast territories to the United States, which included areas such as California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. As a result, millions of Mexicans found themselves living within the borders of the United States. However, it's important to note that the migration of Mexican Americans was not solely the result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Other treaties and agreements, such as the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, which ceded additional territories to the United States, also contributed to the movement. Furthermore, the Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century, which caused widespread instability and violence in Mexico, prompted many Mexicans to seek refuge in the United States. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican Americans faced significant challenges and discrimination in the United States. They were often subjected to racial prejudice, legal and social exclusion, and economic exploitation. Despite these hardships, they persevered and made valuable contributions to the development and culture of the southwestern United States. Today, Mexican Americans are an integral part of American society, and their influence can be seen in various aspects of life, including art, literature, music, food, and politics. As we wrap up today's episode, I hope you learned something new and fascinating about the war between Mexico and the United States and the impact it had on both nations. It's a significant period in history that has shaped the modern world we live in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us and helps us create more engaging content for you. We've got plenty more crazy and funky facts from human history just waiting to be uncovered. So join us back here every week for new adventures through time. Chapter 5: Aftermath and Legacy. The war radically changed the map of North America. The United States had fulfilled manifest destiny, stretching from sea to sea. But the cost was deep. Tens of thousands died. Mexico lost land, resources, and pride. The new U.S. territories reignited fierce debates over slavery, laying the groundwork for the Civil War. In Mexico, the war is remembered as a national trauma. In the United States, it's often overshadowed by the Civil War. But it was the first U.S. war fought primarily on foreign soil and a test run for many Civil War generals. As the U.S. prepared to take over California, a group of Mormon pioneers arrived in the valley of the Great Salt Lake. They were led by Brigham Young, who would become the first governor of Utah Territory. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, Mexico agreed to give up all claims to Texas and New Mexico and to stay out of the Pacific Northwest. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million. It also provided for the rights of Mexicans living in the U.S. territories. Many chose to stay, becoming U.S. citizens, or moving north to continue fighting against American expansion. In 1853, the U.S. purchased the Gadsden Purchase, an area that included parts of southern Arizona and New Mexico. The U.S. wanted this territory to build a southern transcontinental railroad. In the mid-1800s, Americans began heading west in large numbers. Many were immigrants fleeing difficult economic conditions in their homelands. Others were young men seeking adventure. Still others were families looking for new lives on the frontier. The rush to settle the West would have a profound effect on Native Americans. As settlers moved onto tribal lands, most tribes were forced to move west of the Mississippi. Some, like the Cherokee, had already been forcibly relocated once before. Most were never able to return to their traditional homelands. In the U.S., the war with Mexico renewed the debate over slavery. Should newly acquired territories be slave or free? This fight would culminate in the Civil War. During the war, President James Polk kept the U.S. Army small, relying instead on volunteers. By the end of the war, he had more than 78,000 soldiers. That left the regular army at 16,000, smaller than when the war began. After the war, calls grew louder for larger standing army. This led to the creation of the Gadsden Purchase, an area that included parts of southern Arizona and New Mexico. The U.S. purchased this territory to build a southern transcontinental railroad. During the 1800s, Americans began heading west in large numbers. Many were immigrants fleeing difficult economic conditions in their homelands. Others were young men seeking adventure. Still others were families looking for new lives on the frontier. The rush to settle the West would have a profound effect on Native Americans. As settlers moved onto tribal lands, most tribes were forced to move west of the Mississippi. Some, like the Cherokee, had already been forcibly relocated once before. Most were never able to return to their traditional homelands. In the U.S., the war with Mexico renewed the debate over slavery. Should newly acquired territories be slave or free? This fight would culminate in the Civil War. During the war, President James Polk kept the U.S. Army small, relying instead on volunteers. By the end of the war, he had more than 78,000 soldiers. That left the regular army at 16,000, smaller than when the war began. After the war, calls grew louder for a larger standing army. This led to the creation of the Gadsden Purchase, an area that included parts of southern Arizona and New Mexico. The U.S. purchased this territory to build a southern transcontinental railroad. During the 1800s, Americans began heading west in large numbers. Many were immigrants fleeing difficult economic conditions in their homelands. Others were young men seeking adventure. Still others were families looking for new lives on the frontier. The rush to settle the West would have a profound effect on Native Americans. As settlers moved onto tribal lands, most tribes were forced to move west of the Mississippi. Some, like the Cherokee, had already been forcibly relocated once before. Most were never able to return to their traditional homelands. In the U.S., the war with Mexico renewed the debate over slavery. Should newly acquired territories be slave or free? This fight would culminate in the Civil War. During the war, President James Polk kept the U.S. Army small, relying instead on volunteers. By the end of the war, he had more than 78,000 soldiers. That left the regular army at 16,000, smaller than when the war began. After the war, calls grew louder for a larger standing army. In Mexico, the war with the U.S. was a national trauma. The country had lost nearly half its territory. Although the war had been fought over issues far from over, there was no appetite for another conflict with the U.S. for decades to come. General Winfield Scott played a key role in the U.S. victory. His skill and leadership made him a national hero. However, his strategy of relying on a strong navy and a few well-trained troops was questioned by some. Zachary Taylor, who led U.S. forces in the capture of Monterey, was seen by many as a better general. He was elected president in 1848. Scott would later go on to lead the Union Army during the Civil War. General Antonio Lopez de Santa. Anna had been an important figure in Mexico since he helped overthrow the Spanish monarchy in 1821. He served as both president and emperor. During his lifetime, he was a controversial figure whose policies alienated many Mexicans. Some believed he was a traitor who gave away too much land to the United States. Others argued that he was a martyr who sacrificed himself for the good of his country. In the United States, the Mexican War is often overshadowed by the Civil War. However, it was an important early chapter in American history. It was the first war fought primarily on foreign soil. It also provided a testing ground for many of the generals who would fight in the Civil War. Additionally, the war had a profound impact on the future of slavery in the United States. The acquisition of new territories raised the question of whether these areas would be slave or free. This issue would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. In conclusion, the Mexican War had a profound impact on both Mexico and the United States. For Mexico, the war resulted in the loss of territory, national humiliation, and political instability. Santa Anna's legacy is a controversial one, but his contributions to Mexican history are undeniable. For the United States, the war was a victory that led to the acquisition of vast amounts of new territory. The war also helped to fuel the debate over slavery, which would eventually erupt into the Civil War. Overall, the Mexican War was a significant event in the history of both nations, and its effects are still felt today. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the Mexican War, we highly encourage you to check out our other videos on the topic. We have covered everything from the causes of the war to its major battles and lasting impacts. You can find these videos by searching for the Mexican War on our channel. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on all of our latest content. We would also appreciate it if you could leave us a like and comment below to let us know what you thought of the video. Your feedback is extremely valuable to us and helps us to keep improving. Thanks again for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video. Zachary Taylor, who led U.S. forces in the capture of Monterrey, was seen by many as a better general. He was elected president in 1848. Scott would later go on to lead the Union Army during the Civil War in Mexico. The war with the U.S. was a national trauma. The country had lost nearly half its territory. Although the war had been fought over issues far from over, there was no appetite for another conflict with the U.S. for decades to come. In the United States, the Mexican War is often overshadowed by the Civil War. However, it was an important early chapter in American history. It was the first war fought primarily on foreign soil. It also provided a testing ground for many of the generals who would fight in the Civil War. Additionally, the war had a profound impact on the future of slavery in the United States. The acquisition of new territories raised the question of whether these areas would be slave or free. This issue would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. In conclusion, the Mexican War had a profound impact on both Mexico and the United States. For Mexico, the war resulted in the loss of territory, national humiliation, and political instability. Santa Anna's legacy is a controversial one, but his contributions to Mexican history are undeniable. For the United States, the war was a victory that led to the acquisition of vast amounts of new territory. The war also helped to fuel the debate over slavery, which would eventually erupt into the Civil War. Overall, Mexican War was a significant event in the history of both nations, and its effects are still felt today.